Hey everybody, I've been getting a lot of questions about the Federal Reserve System, so I thought I'd just take a minute to record a video to try to respond to those questions. With the Federal Reserve, which I will be referring to as the Fed, if you dig into the details of the Fed and what it does, how it does it, and so on, it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. But to understand the basics of it is actually pretty straightforward. Um, So the Federal Reserve deals with monetary policy, right? The Federal Reserve System deals with monetary policy. That means that the Fed is in charge of handling policies that appertain to the value of the dollar and the way it circulates. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, what's called a dual mandate. It's supposed to do two things at the same time, right? First, it's supposed to try to maintain maximum employment, right? Employment at the maximum level possible. And second, it's supposed to make sure that prices stay stable, that we avoid inflation. Basically, what this boils down to is that it's the Federal Reserve's responsibility to try to see to it that we have a monetary policy that encourages sustainable economic growth. That's what it was created to do. It was created in 1913 in response to the fact that the United States economy is subject to a pretty serious and routine boom and bust cycle. It just sort of seems to be kind of built into capitalism and how capitalism operates, right? That it goes through this sort of boom and bust business cycle. And if you look at American economic history, particularly if you start in the 19th century when capitalism really started to get rolling, you see that our economic growth is punctuated by events that they call panics. Or economic panics, and there are lots of them, right? You can go back in time and look at the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Panic of 1873, which sparked what was at the time back in 1873 called the Great Depression, lasted for half a decade, right? Massive economic downturn. Then of course it ended up being surpassed by the Great Depression of the 1930s. But anyhow, you get the gist, right? Lots of these economic panics. And what happened in these panics is that basically the whole economic system would tumble, right? You would get what they called runs on the banks, right? This is when the economy looks like it's turning bad. You would have people running all at once to the banks to try to get all their money out of the bank, right? To try to get hard currency out of the bank. And the bank would basically run out of money and then have to close, right? And then so anybody else who was still holding on to, receipts saying, hey, I deposited money in the bank, I would like to get it out now. They're just, what's the phrase? SOL, right? Something out of luck, right? So banks fail, people lose their savings, they lose their investments. The banks that don't fail start going out trying to call in their debts, right? Calling in the loans that they've given out, calling in their mortgages. People start defaulting on their loans. Businesses start folding. People start having their mortgages foreclosed upon, right? And you just have this sort of rippling effect all throughout the system, all stemming from basically the insolvency of the banks, right? The banks start to fail, and then everything else fails, right? So in 1913, Congress created the Federal Reserve System and gave it the job of basically trying to avoid this boom and bust cycle, or to at least try to clip the sharp edges off of it, right? Try to where we had an economy that fluctuates up and down like this. Right, the Federal Reserve its job is basically to try to come in and limit the bandwidth, right? Limit the fluctuation, right? So we still have recessions, we still have boom times, we still have recessions. What we want to avoid, though, is the sort of giant crater that you get that lands you into something like the Great Depression, whether you're talking about the one in the 1930s or the one in the 1870s. So far, so good. So the tools that the Federal Reserve has that it uses to try to manage the economy. There are really two main things, right? Two main things that it does by way of monetary policy, right? The Federal Reserve sets what's called the federal funds rate, right? The federal funds rate basically is the interest rate that banks charge each other when they are loaning money to each other, right? So the Fed can raise or lower the federal funds rate. The other thing that the Federal Reserve can do is it can either issue or purchase government bonds. What government bonds are, basically, they're just little increments of government debt, right? Little IOUs that the government promises to buy back later with interest, right? Again, so far so good. The purpose of both of these tools is to either inject extra cash into the economy or to pull extra cash out of the economy, right? If it looks like we're going into an economic downturn, the Fed will lower the federal funds rate and start purchasing federal bonds, right? The effect of both of those is to inject extra money into the economy in the hopes that it causes that it has a stimulating effect, right, and causes the economy to improve. Right, and then if it seems like things are getting overheated in the economy, right, if it seems like we're maybe having a growth that is unsustainable, that's going to lead to inflation, which is going to cause things to get more expensive, then the Fed can raise the Federal Reserve can raise the federal funds rate, and it can start issuing federal bonds. Both of those have the effect of pulling cash out of the economy in hopes of cooling it down, right? Try to keep it within a narrow bandwidth. Again, so far so good. So the idea is, that the Federal Reserve has tools at its disposal to try to step in to stimulate the economy if it needs stimulating, or to try to dampen it if it needs dampening, right? Okay, so it's also sometimes asked. So we've covered where the Federal Reserve came from. We've covered the basic gist of what it does and how it does it. There was a last question about why the Federal Reserve is created as an independent agency. Why does it get to act outside of the bounds of our normal checks and balances system? And the idea, I think, behind that is that you want these kinds of decisions about monetary policy. You want your monetary policy decisions to be made by people who are neutral experts on the economy, right? You don't want those decisions to be being made by partisan politicians who would be tempted to use the tools of monetary policy for their own advantage, right? For their own political advantage, rather than the overall long-term economic advantage of the United States, right? At least that's the idea. Right, that's the idea of creating an independent Federal Reserve System. So I hope this clears up some confusion. This is, of course, what I've given you, a simplified version of what the Fed is, but it definitely gives you a sense of the basics of how it operates, what it does, and why it does it. So anyway, if you have any further questions about this, let me know. All right, have a good one.